In the year 580, a queen knelt to pray inside a stone chapel near Canterbury. That was 17 years before Rome sent its first missionary to England, and the chapel is standing today exactly where she prayed. People gather inside it for services right now, not as a memory of what used to happen there, but as an actual weekly service. Almost no other church in Britain can make that same claim, because most of the ones that look ancient were rebuilt long after they were founded. This is a tour of 8 churches that were never rebuilt away from their original stone. 4 of them predate the Norman conquest, 4 were built in the century right after it, and every one of them holds services today. Britain has thousands of churches with pointed arches and stone towers that look medieval from the road. Almost none of them actually are. Most of what you're looking at in an old English parish church was rebuilt, extended, or gutted by restorers in the 1800s, so the walls under that ivy are often younger than the United States. That's not a knock on those buildings. It's just the honest starting point for this list, because the 8 churches here are the rare exception to that pattern. This tour covers 2 different waves of construction. The first 4 churches were built before 1066, in the centuries when England was still a patchwork of separate Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and the Norman conquest hadn't happened yet. The second 4 went up in the century immediately following 1066, when a new Norman ruling class started putting up churches in a completely different style, with round arches and carved stone doorways. Every church on this list has to pass 2 tests before it earns a place here. First, the building itself has to be genuinely OLD, not just an old founding date attached to a newer building. Second, it has to be an ascetic church today, with real services, not a museum that used to be one. Start with the one that breaks the pattern completely, because every church after it in this tour gets measured against what it proves is possible. Queen Bertha's chapel from the opening is called St. Martin's Church today, and it sits on a low hill just outside the old walls of Canterbury. Bertha was a Christian princess from Frankish Gaul who married King Ethelbert of Kent, and by around the year 580 she was already using this building as her private chapel, decades before the English kingdoms had any organised church structure of their own. What makes St. Martin's different from almost every other old church in Britain is what it was built out of. The Anglo-Saxons didn't start from scratch. They reused a building that had already been standing on that hill since the Roman occupation of Britain, and you can still see the evidence today. Thin, flat Roman bricks sit in the walls alongside later Anglo-Saxon and medieval stonework, layered on top of each other like rings in a tree. Augustine of Canterbury arrived from Rome in 597, sent by the Pope to convert the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to Christianity, and Bertha's already functioning chapel gave him a foothold to work from. Kent at that point was one small kingdom among several, ruled by a pagan king married to a Christian queen, and St. Martin's was the one building in the entire region where that queen could practice her own faith without changing her husband's. Augustine worked from that foothold as the wider mission got underway, which means the church you can walk into today was already doing real work before the mission that made Canterbury famous had even properly started. St. Martin's is now officially described as the oldest church building in the English-speaking world still used for worship, and it forms part of the Canterbury World Heritage Site alongside Canterbury Cathedral and the ruins of St. Augustine's Abbey. Stand inside it today, and the Roman brick is still at eye level, not roped off in a display case, just sitting in a wall that people lean against while they wait for a service to start. Here's the honest part, because it matters for a claim this big. You'll see St. Martin's described as having roughly 1,400 years of continuous prayer inside it, and that number is a reasonable estimate built from Bertha's documented chapel and the church's long, unbroken status as a working parish. It's not, however, a verified year-by-year record, since nobody kept an attendance log across 14 centuries. What is documented is the founding date, the Roman brick, and the current active congregation. What is tradition is the exact, unbroken count of years in between. Either way, the basic fact holds up under real scrutiny. This is a functioning Church of England parish church, with a vicar and a congregation, sitting on foundations that predate the English language as we'd recognise it. People walked in for a service last Sunday, in a building that was already old when Canterbury Cathedral hadn't even been built yet. Escomb Church sits in a small village in County Durham, and from the outside it looks almost too plain to matter. That plainness is exactly the point. Escomb is one of only 4 complete Anglo-Saxon churches left standing in England, founded somewhere around the year 670, and unlike St Martin's, it wasn't repeatedly patched and expanded over the centuries. Viewed from the north side, the wall you are looking at is still pure 7th century stone, with nothing later bolted onto it. The Anglo-Saxon builders did what people in this period usually did when they needed good stone fast. They took it from the Romans. Escomb was built largely from materials stripped out of the nearby Roman fort at Binchester, a few miles away, and the church still has an original Saxon sundial mounted on its wall, one of the oldest working sundials in the country. Look closely at the corners of the building and you can see long, upright stones alternating with shorter flat ones, a technique called long and short work that Anglo-Saxon masons used to rinface a corner without proper foundations. Heritage bodies that study these buildings for a living single out ESCOMB specifically because it lets you see that technique with nothing else competing for your attention. There's no later tower stacked on top, no Victorian side chapel bolted onto the nave, no stained glass replacing a plainer Saxon window. What you get instead is a small, dim, stone room that has looked close to the same for roughly 1300 years, small enough that a single congregation would have filled it shoulder to shoulder even on an ordinary Sunday in the 7th century. Now, for the honest gap in this one, because a straight continuity story would be misleading. Escomb wasn't always the working parish church. The new, bigger church was built in the village in the 1800s, and for a stretch of time, Escomb's old Saxon building was sidelined, no longer the main site of worship. It was carefully restored and reinstated as the active parish church in 1969, and it has held regular services ever since. That gap doesn't disqualify Escomb from this list. If anything, it makes the survival more interesting, because the building didn't just sit untouched by accident. People deliberately chose to bring a 1300-year-old church back into active use, stone, sundial and all, instead of letting it become a monument you look at from behind a rope. If Escomb is the smallest and plainest of the Anglo-Saxon survivors, All Saints in Brixworth is the opposite. This is the biggest and boldest of them, originally built as part of a monastery founded before the year 675, and large sections of that original building are still standing inside the present-day church. In 1930, one architectural historian described Brixworth as perhaps the most imposing architectural memorial of the 7th century surviving north of the Alps. That's a direct, attributed claim from someone who studied the building closely, not this show's own opinion, and once you know what to look for, it holds up. Brixworth was built as a basilica, a long hall shape with a rounded apse at one end, and its walls include thin Roman bricks pulled from Roman sites at Leicester and Towcester, stacked alongside heavier stone in a way you can still trace today. The scowl is what separates Brixworth from almost everything else on this list. Most surviving Anglo-Saxon churches are small, parish-sized buildings, but Brixworth was built at monastery scale, with an ambulatory, a walking passage that once ran around the apse, letting monks and pilgrims move around the holiest part of the building without walking straight through it. That kind of architectural planning was rare in England at a time when most ordinary buildings were still made of timber and mud, and it tells you Brixworth was never meant to be a small local chapel. It was built as a statement by a monastery with the resources and ambition to build like Rome, not like the rest of Anglo-Saxon England. Later centuries chipped away at the original footprint. Parts of the monastery complex around the church didn't survive, and what stands today is smaller than the 7th century original. Even so, the surviving core, the walls, the arches, the reused Roman brick, is still large enough that you can read the shape of the full building in what remains, the way you can read a whole sentence from half of it. It's still, today, an active parish church, not a ruin managed by a heritage trust and not a building preserved purely for its architecture. A working congregation gathers inside a structure that was already an old, established building by the time the Vikings started raiding the English coast a little over a century later. Every church so far on this list has been built from stone. St Andrew's in Greensted, Essex, isn't, and that's exactly why it belongs here. Greensted is claimed to be the oldest wooden church in the world, and probably the oldest timber building still standing anywhere in Europe. Its nave walls are made from split oak logs, whole tree trunks cut in half lengthwise, and stood on end, flat side facing in, side by side in a tight row, a construction method almost nothing else from this period has survived long enough to show us. Picture what that actually took. Every log in that wall was a full OAK tree, felled with hand tools, split down its length, and dragged upright into position without the benefit of a single power tool or crane. Most timber buildings from Anglo-Saxon England were ordinary homes, workshops, and halls, the everyday buildings historians know the least about, because wood rots, burns, and gets replaced within a couple of generations. Greensted is the rare survivor that lets you stand inside that vanished, everyday version of early medieval Britain instead of only reading about it. To be clear about this one, because two different claims about Greensted get blurred together constantly, and this claim deserves the real version. Tree ring dating on the surviving oak timbers puts their construction at around the year 1053, which makes the wood you can actually touch today an 11th century structure, not a 7th century one. Separately, archaeological excavation at the same site found evidence of even earlier wooden buildings, dating back to the late 500s or the early 600s. That earlier building did exist, it's just not the timber standing in front of you now, and those are two different facts from two different centuries on the same patch of ground. Treating them as one unbroken building overstates what the digging and the tree rings actually prove. Even with that caveat, what remains is still genuinely rare, because most timber from this era never got the chance to last this long. Greensted's oak nave beat those odds for close to 1,000 years, and it's not a museum piece behind glass. It's a functioning parish church that holds a service every single week, meaning people are still worshipping today, sitting inside split oak logs that were already standing before the Battle of Hastings in a building type that has almost entirely vanished everywhere else on Earth. Every church covered so far predates the Battle of Hastings in 1066. Canterbury, Escomb, Brixworth, and Greensted all belong to a Britain that had no Norman kings, no Norman castles, and no Norman church law, because none of that existed yet. What comes next is the generation right after the conquest, when a new ruling class started building in stone across England, Scotland, and Wales, all within about 50 years of each other, somewhere between 1140 and 1187. The architecture changes completely. Instead of reused Roman brick and long and short Saxon stonework, you get round Romanesque arches and carved doorways. The test stays exactly the same, though real medieval fabric plus a real congregation today. The stakes go up here because Norman builders left behind carved detail and named founders that Anglo-Saxon builders rarely did, which means these next 4 entries can be checked against the historical record with a precision the first 4 can't match. First up is Scotland's best preserved example of the whole style. Dalmeny Kirk sits just outside Edinburgh, and it was probably built around the year 1160 by Gospatrick III, Earl of Lothian. There's a genuine irony worth sitting with here. Gospatric's grandfather was an Anglo-Saxon earl who fled to Scotland after the Norman conquest displaced him, and 2 generations later, his family was building a church in the new Norman architectural style anyway. Dalmeny is widely described as the best preserved Norman parish church in Scotland, and walking around it, that claim is easy to believe. The nave, the chancel, and the rounded apse all survive largely intact from the original build. The only major later addition is the tower, which was rebuilt in 1937, and even that was a rebuild rather than a redesign. Carved Romanesque detail runs along the south doorway, figures and patterns cut directly into the stone by masons working in a style newly imported from Norman France, the same visual language that shows up in churches on the other side of the Channel around the same decades. That matters because Scotland wasn't conquered by the Normans the way England was. There was no single battle and no crowned Norman king. Instead, Norman-style barons like Gospatric's family were gradually absorbed into the Scottish nobility, invited in by Scottish kings who wanted the same administrative and military structures the Normans had brought south of the border. Dalmeny is a physical result of that slower, quieter kind of change. A Norman-style church built inside a kingdom the Normans never actually invaded. What is remarkable is how little of Dalmeny needed redoing at all. Set aside that one tower rebuild in 1937, and the nave, chancel and apse Gospatric's masons raised are still the actual walls standing today, still doing exactly the job they were built for 900 years ago, without the wholesale Victorian rebuilds so many English parish churches went through. Dalmeny, now known formally as St Cuthbert's, holds services every Sunday, with worship in the morning and again in the afternoon. A congregation still gathers under a Romanesque doorway carved almost 900 years ago inside a building that has stayed a working church the entire time rather than becoming a monument somewhere along the way. Pair that with its closest architectural cousin, because the next church on this list was likely worked on by some of the same stonemasons. St Athernase Church in the Fife village of Leuchars was built between 1183 and 1187 by Robert de Quincey, a Norman lord who had already built the nearby Leuchars castle. In 1185, Ness, son of William, Lord of Leuchars, granted the church to the canons of St Andrews, a transfer of ownership that is actually recorded, not just assumed from the architecture. The chancel and the half-round apse are the standout T12H century sections, with blind arcading and round Norman arches running along the outside. Look closely at the stonework and you will find masons' marks, small carved symbols individual stonemasons used to track their own work, and several of the marks at Leuchars are identical to marks found at Durham Cathedral, hundreds of miles south. That is a checkable, physical link between two building projects on opposite sides of the country, not folklore, and it means the same trained hands, or at least the same trained tradition, worked on one of England's grandest cathedrals and this comparatively small Scottish parish church within the same generation. The building also holds objects far older than its own walls. A fragment of a 9th century cross slab, carved stone from centuries before the Normans arrived, was found near the village and is now kept inside the church, alongside 3 elaborate 16th century memorial stones for the Bruce family of nearby Earlshall, the local lords of that later era. Layer by layer, Leuchars holds evidence of nearly 1,000 years of continuous local history inside one building. To be honest about the building's full history, Leuchars isn't a frozen time capsule the way Escomb is. A belfry was added around the year 1700 and the nave was restored in 1858. In 1914, restoration work by the architect Reginald Fairley reintegrated the chancel and nave, so what you're looking at is a genuine medieval core with visible later stitching, not an untouched original. That honesty doesn't take anything away from what still counts as authentic. St Athernase remains an 8-taff Church of Scotland parish church today, open to the public through the summer months and used for regular worship the rest of the year, more than 8 centuries after Robert de Quincey first commissioned it. From a parish church built by a castle builder, the next entry moves somewhere stranger, a church built like a fortress. Ewenny Priory was founded in 1141 by Maurice de Landres, a Norman lord, as an offshoot of the Benedictine Abbey at Gloucester. The architectural historian John Newman called it the most complete and impressive Norman ecclesiastical building in Glamorgan, and unlike most of the entries on this list, Ewenny earns that description through something other than pure age or carving. Ewenny was fortified early in its history, when the priory was surrounded with defensive walls and gatehouses built specifically to guard against Welsh raids on the monastery. It wasn't an isolated decision either, because Ewenny sat inside a wider defensive network alongside the nearby castles of Coity, Ogmore and Newcastle at Bridgend, which means this was, in effect, a monastery built with the same defensive thinking as a castle. Maurice de Landres and the other Norman lords who settled this part of Wales weren't moving into empty land. They were pushing into territory the Welsh had held for centuries, and local resistance to that expansion was real and ongoing, not a distant background detail. A monastery here wasn't a peaceful retreat from the world the way monasteries are usually imagined. It was a Norman foothold that needed walls thick enough to survive being attacked, staffed by monks who lived with that risk as part of daily life rather than as an occasional threat. That combination, a working religious community protected like a military outpost, makes Ewenny one of the Estrange buildings on this list, and it's worth being precise about what survives today, because the site is genuinely SP-Light in two. The monastic East End, the presbytery, the choir, and the south transept is now managed as a ruin by Caer W, the Welsh heritage body, and you visit that part the way you'd visit any ancient monument. The Norman nave, however, is a separate, still active parish church owned by the Diocese of Llandaff, and services continue there today. Ewenny, then, isn't simply an old church still in use the way Canterbury or Escomb are. It's a working church standing right next to its own ruins, half monument and half congregation, inside walls that were originally built to survive an armed attack rather than just the passage of time. What comes last on this list is the opposite kind of standute, a church built purely to be looked at, and it delivers on that promise better than anything else here. Kilpeck Church, in Herefordshire, was built around the year 1140, almost certainly before 1143, since that's the year it was formally given to Gloucester Abbey. The architectural historian Nicolaas Pevsner called it one of the most perfect Norman churches in England, and out of everything on this list, Kilpeck is the one built to be looked at as much as prayed in. The carving is the reason. Around the south doorway, a tree OF life design wins through the stonework in a level of detail rarely seen surviving from this period anywhere in the country, framing the entrance the way an illuminated manuscript frames its opening letter. Running around the entire outside of the building, under the roofline, sits a corbel table, a row of carved stone brackets, holding roughly 85 surviving carved figures. Some are animals, some are human faces, and a few are creatures that don't map onto anything in the natural world at all. Historians attribute the work to a group of masons, sometimes called the Herefordshire School, possibly guided by craftsmen recruited in France by the local lord who commissioned the building, which would explain why the carving here looks more ambitious than almost anything else being built in England at the time. Among the carvings is the well-known Sheelanagig, a carved figure that has puzzled and fascinated visitors for centuries and still gets debated by historians today. To be precise about the number, since sources vary slightly, the original corbel table likely held around 91 figures, and about 85 have survived intact, close enough to the original count that walking the full circuit of the building still gives you almost the complete set the masons carved. Here's the part historians genuinely can't explain, and it's worth saying plainly instead of glossing over it. During the Reformation and the Puritan period of the 1600s, carved religious imagery like this was frequently defaced or destroyed across England. Kilpeck's carvings, including images some Puritans would likely have found offensive, survived that period almost completely intact, and nobody has a confirmed explanation why. The survival itself is documented. The reason for it isn't. Kilpeck is still an active Church of England parish church today, a Grade 1 listed building that has been carefully repaired in 1864, 1898 and 1962 without losing any of its original medieval carving. A congregation still worships inside a building most people would only expect to find behind museum glass. That's the real thread running through all 8 of these places. From a Queen's chapel in Kent to a carved Norman doorway in Herefordshire, what actually survived 1,000 years was never really the stone. It was P. Opley who kept choosing to walk through the door on a Sunday. Tell us in the comments which one of these 8 you'd want to stand in.